Hello, I'm Becky Goldsmith with Piece of Cake. I want to show you now how to turn an outer point sewing with the horizon from right to left. Now this is a leaf that I've already begun sewing. I started sewing down here and now I'm near the outer point. In fact, I can make one more stitch and I'll be about 3/16 of an inch away from the point itself. Now I want to zoom the camera in so you can see more clearly what I'm doing. When you are close to the outer point, within 3/16 of an inch or so from the inside edge of your chalk line, you want to shorten your stitch length. So while my stitches up to this point would be a little bit bigger than 1/16 of an inch, from here on to the inside edge of the line here that marks the second side of the point, I'm going to shorten my stitches so that they're about 1/16 of an inch long. The reason you do that is because if you leave your stitches too far apart down here, when you turn the seam allowance under at the outer point, it will push up, and if there are gaps between your stitches, that edge will look puffy, sort of like a pie crust, and you don't want that. Bring your needle up at the inside edge of that line. If you sew beyond the line, the chalk will show when you turn the point. You want to do a tack stitch here. What I mean by that is that your needle will go in right across the fold from where the thread has come out of the applique, as if you were starting another stitch. But instead of sewing forward, you're going to make a stitch in place. And notice how I brought my thumbnail up close. That helps control where I bring the needle out of that applique fabric. So it's a loop. It's a tack stitch right there. What that does is keep these stitches from getting loose as you turn the seam allowance under at the point. Now I'm going to remove this pin because I don't need it anymore. I'm going to turn the applique in my hand and put my thumb in position to sew down the other side. Now this little corner of fabric here is a dog ear, and you can cut it off or not if it suits you. If you cut it off even with the raw edge of the fabric here. Never reach underneath and cut away excess fabric that you can't see. It's not structurally sound if you cut off too much of the seam allowance underneath this edge. Now, I'm going to park my needle out of the way and pick up my toothpick. Let me back the camera up just a bit so you can see what I'm doing again. I've got my toothpick in my hand. Now, I dampen my toothpick in my mouth. You don't want it drippy wet, but you want it damp enough so that the wood grain is raised. And when you do that, it will grab the fabric a little better. Now, there are two ways you can go about turning under this seam allowance. The first is to place the toothpick over that fold with the point of the toothpick even with the cut edge of the seam allowance. I push down with my finger, and then this is a windshield wiper motion. You just pivot that toothpick and the seam allowance goes under. It's nice and neat, works like a charm. That said, this is a little bit of a tricky movement. I will show it to you again in a minute. Let me come in just a little bit. There's another way to turn this seam allowance. This way is what I call the poking it in method. You put your toothpick at the end of the point, right here at the end of this seam allowance, and just poke it gently. Now when you poke that in, it's likely that you're going to pull that fabric under like I just did there. If you do, take the thread and pull it out in the direction of a point. And that's another good way to start this point. Now, in close-up, let me show you the first way again. Placing the toothpick over the fold and rotate, just like that. See how you can get just a little bit farther, and you could choose which method works best for you. Now, no matter how you get the point to this part, the thing that you absolutely do not want to do is to put your toothpick here and fold it under. Because every time you do that, what you're going to get is a pleat and a fold and a squared off point. It's just nearly impossible to make a good point by folding it in here next. So what do you do instead? Well, remember that I have either poked or pivoted in this end. The next thing I'm going to do is take my toothpick. Now I'm cupping it in my hand backwards like this just a bit. I'm going to put the toothpick in at the point and I'm going to sweep back away from the point. Now what I'm doing when I do that is anything that might have gotten folded under where you don't want it, jammed up here at the point, I'm smoothing that bulkiness away from the point. And then I might take the thread and pull it out in the direction of the point. The next thing I'm going to do is take my toothpick, and again you can think of this like a windshield wiper motion. What I'm going to do is pivot that fabric underneath there. Think about what you want to happen here. You want the fabric to roll underneath like that. You don't want it to fold underneath and be a big wad at the point. So here we go. I'm placing my toothpick not on top of this fold, but next to it. My toothpick is damp, so it will grab the fabric better. And I'm going to just pivot again, just like that. Now, in case anything got bulky underneath there, I use my toothpick and I sweep away. Notice that my thumb is in position. I don't have my thumb back here or down here looking at it. You've got to have your thumb close so that when you turn this seam allowance under, you can hold it in place. Now, that is a good point right there. If I roll it up, you can tell that the chalk line has been turned under. I'm able to make at least 2 or 3 stitches here before I need to worry about what's down there. So I am not going to worry about what's down there yet. Don't. Go ahead and make your stitches once you've got that seam allowance turned under. You can, if you want, make a stitch off the end of the point. I very, very rarely do that. It's subtle, but I begin my next stitch just barely on the second side of the point. And again, because there's bulkiness underneath there, you don't want to make your stitches too far apart. So I'm making a shorter stitch here. The distance between them is about 1/16 of an inch. Now, you're going to get to this part 2 or 3 stitches beyond the point where you need to deal with a crease that is probably in your fabric right there. Now, most of you at this point are probably used to coming over here and just folding this under. And I'm going to use the toothpick because I can use it better here and show you what I mean. If you would come over here and do that, you're likely to get a little bit of a point there. And that's caused because the fabric is a little bit creased, and when you fold it over on itself, you get a bit of a pleat. There are 2 ways you can deal with this, because as I'm sewing this, I know I'm going to have that problem. I can see it coming. One thing you can do anytime you're likely to get a pleat on the edge of your applique is to turn it under in smaller increments. So I'm reaching underneath this pleat with my needle, and I can pull in just enough to make a stitch. And I could make a stitch here, and then I could do it again and again and again. But I've watched too many people applique, and I know that not everyone has that much patience. So let's say that you do go ahead and do this, and that you end up with that little bit of a point there. And you might think to yourself, well, no one's ever going to notice that, so I'm just going to sew it down and leave it there and ignore it. Well, let me tell you, I'm sorry to say that everyone is going to notice that. So it's better just to fix it, and fixing it is easy. To fix that pleat, you reach inside there with your toothpick and smooth it open to the right. I'm using my damp toothpick. I'm going to get in front of it and smooth it open to the left. If I need to, I'll get back behind it and smooth it again open to the right, working that pleat out until the outer edge is smooth and the seam allowance on the underside is also smooth. Once you have smoothed out the second side and you've moved beyond the bulk at the point, you can go ahead and resume your normal stitch length and continue sewing down the leaf.